My name is Jack Stein, and this is my final project for History 233. And today I'm going to be looking at how British wartime propaganda turned the tide of World War II. However, before I start with that, I want to do a quick recap between the end of World War One, the rise of the Nazis, and then the start of World War II, because I want to provide a little bit of context before I break down three primary sources of British propaganda from World War II. I'm not going to do a super in-depth analysis of in between World War One and World War II because there's a lot there, and that would take a ton of time, but I'm going to give just a brief summary of what happened and how we got to World War II, just to provide some context. On November 11th of 1918, the Western Front fell silent and the Germans laid down their guns and surrendered, which finally marked the end of World War One. So obviously the German and their allies, the Central Powers, were the losers of this war, and it was left up to Great Britain, France, Russia, and the other Allied powers to determine their fate. And the once great German Empire was forced to cede a ton of their territory. They were forced to pay massive reparations to France and other countries that had suffered massive destruction as a result of the war. And on top of this, they were forced to limit their military, so they couldn't have more than a small number of troops, a small number of aircrafts, warships. Effectively, the German Empire was gone, and in the wake of the German Empire came the Weimar Republic. And while the Weimar Republic did introduce some democratic principles to the country, they were handicapped by just a ruined economy because they were paying millions of dollars of reparations to the countries that had suffered the most damage from World War One, and of course the Germans themselves had suffered massive loss and destruction from World War One. And so they kind of just descended into a massive hyperinflation. As you can see, there was a $50 million German mark. They were printing so much money that the currency was so inflated that this is what they came to. It was $50 million on one bill. And with that being said, people were not happy. Obviously, there was no jobs, there was hardly any food, and so people were unhappy with the current government. And so the Natural Socialist Party, better known as the Nazis, saw this as an opportunity to gain traction in the country. Before this, they were just a small right-wing faction in German politics. And so, led by the charismatic Adolf Hitler, they started to rise to power. They were harping on people's fears about the current government, that they were weak, and they were able to appeal to the people's nationalistic sense that look at how great the German Empire used to be, and now we're weak and we're giving all this money to these countries. And there was this belief in the Nazis and among the German people that uh, Germany could have won World War One, and had they not surrendered, then they would have gone on to win the war eventually. I think most people would say that that is probably not true, but a lot of people believed it. And they were able to use this sense of nationalism and pride in your country and combine it with a lot of fear mongering to get people to buy into their message. And I think it's pretty widely known, but the Nazis targeted mainly the Jewish people. They said the Jewish population was working from the inside to try to destroy Germany, that they were all traitors, and anything they could say to get people to turn against the Jewish population. And they targeted plenty of other groups too, communists, gypsies, LGBT, any sort of minority that they could use to place the blame on. And eventually in 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed chancellor due to his overwhelming popularity among the German people. And then eventually, when the president died, Hitler became president and made himself the Führer of Germany. And at this point, Hitler had dissolved the country into an authoritarian rule, so no one could stand up to him. And he had a vision to return the German Empire to its glory days before World War One, and even expand on that, take over most of Europe and eventually maybe most of the world. And so, after a couple years of building up their military and their economy, The Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia on March 15th, 1939, and this clearly violated the Treaty of Versailles, which was the agreement that was put in place after World War I to limit the power of the German Empire. They had broken this treaty many times before, but France and Great Britain, in hopes of not starting another world war, they chose to ignore these violations. And even at this point, they did not want to get involved and practically let Germany occupy parts of Czechoslovakia. And then on September 1st, 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland. And it was at this point that Great Britain and France declared war on Nazi Germany. But unfortunately, at this point, it was almost too late because the German army had become incredibly powerful and they had revolutionized the way that we thought about warfare at this time because World War One was mostly trench warfare, so slow moving battles that could take months to years. But the German army was about quick attacks, so their air force, the Luftwaffe, would fly in, bomb cities before opposing armies were even ready, and then that would clear the way for their ground troops to come in to invade. And so after the invasion of Poland, they moved on to take over almost all of mainland Europe, with a few exceptions, but they took over France, Norway, Denmark, Greece, Hungary, Latvia, the Netherlands, and many other European countries. And so after they took over most of mainland Europe, the Nazis turned their attention to Great Britain. Great Britain had just changed their prime minister at this time. Prior to this, it was Neville Chamberlain, who was removed from power because he was seen as the reason why the Nazis were able to take over most of mainland Europe, that he was weak on the Nazis and he let Hitler run rampant in mainland Europe. And he was replaced with the famous Winston Churchill, who was seen as a great war strategist and like the perfect prime minister for wartime, because at this point it was inevitable that the Nazis were going to attack and it was just a matter of time before they did. Because of Great Britain's geography, because it's located across the English Channel, away from the rest of mainland Europe, it was always going to be harder for the Nazis to pull off a ground invasion. And so instead of just crossing the channel and trying to invade Great Britain, they opted to try to bomb it first. And so the Nazis attempted to target both key military and industrial sites. So they wanted to bomb, obviously, Britain's Air Force and their Navy, but they also attacked key industrial sites like grain silos and factories. So if they were unable to invade Britain, they were attempting to starve it into a surrender or into some sort of peace agreement that was favorable for the Nazis. And so this is where the propaganda on the British side comes in. The British government needed to convince people to buy into this war effort, to buy into the idea that if they didn't stand up and do something, the Nazis were going to take over the country and life as they knew would be destroyed. And so the British government, in collaboration with different artists from all over the world, released a series of propaganda to convince British citizens to help out with the war effort in different ways. And so I'm going to be analyzing three of these cartoons. And the first cartoon I wanted to analyze is one made by a Czech artist for the London Department of Transport. And this artist moved from the Czech Republic to London after the Czech Republic was invaded by the Nazis in 1938. So he obviously had an incentive to try and help out the British and help the war effort because he was not only hoping to save Britain from the clutches of the Nazis, but to hopefully free his own country and his own people. And so what this cartoon is trying to do is it's trying to get the British people to buy into the war effort, sort of regain a sense of patriotism for war, because a lot of British people were lukewarm about going into war with the Nazis because they had seen what had happened throughout the rest of Europe, and to this point, the Nazis looked practically unstoppable. So a lot of British people were afraid of the Nazis, and quietly, I think a lot of people and even politicians weren't so sure that they could win a battle with the Nazis. And so the main purpose of this cartoon was to drum up support for the war effort among the British population and to start a campaign for Britain to become more self-sustaining, because prior to this, Britain was a country that would import almost all their goods, all their food, all their equipment. And obviously, during wartime, they were unable to import to the extent that they had been. And so the government wanted to convince people to be self-reliable and be able to make food for themselves, make goods for themselves, and live on their own without all these imports. And one of the ways they wanted to do this was they tried to tell people to use old animal bones and recycle them to turn them into fertilizer so they could grow crops that could feed the population, to make glue for housing and various other uses. And we can see in this cartoon what looks like a young girl carrying a bone, and it's clearly labeled underneath bones. And then in the background, you can see a big bag with a picture of grain or wheat or some sort of crop on it, and then a big vase with a picture of a house. And these are showing that you can turn your unused animal bones into two incredibly useful things that were detrimental for the British to be able to survive the Nazi bombings and the Nazi attacks. And so, obviously, the raw materials produced from the bones that were donated are going to make a big difference in the British surviving the war. But I think just as importantly, this cartoon wanted to show people that they could make a difference, and something as small as unused animal bones from roadkill that they found on the side of the road could make a legitimate impact in making in stopping the Nazis from invading the country. And I think that's important because people needed needed a sense of purpose and a sense of help to really be to really feel like they needed to do something to stop the Nazis, because prior to this they had known that the Nazis were attacking Europe, but it didn't feel as important because it wasn't as close to home. But now that they're trying to attack Britain, the government wanted people to feel a sense of need and a sense of duty to help their country. And cartoons like these played a big role in changing the British attitude about World War II, because prior, British people kind of had a sense of this isn't our problem, we don't want to intervene. But then with the Nazi attacks and British propaganda effort, they started to feel like this was more their war and that they needed to get involved. This next cartoon was created by an artist who was an employee of the National Savings Committee of Britain, and you can see it's sort of in the style of like an old Western wanted poster with some sort of gremlin type thing in the middle. I'm not too sure what that is, but it's designed to be kind of ugly and maybe a little bit scary looking. And this cartoon is aimed to get people to stop spending their money on useless things, or what the British government wanted to show was useless things, and they wanted people to spend their money on the war effort. And so to do this, they wanted to paint people who were spending a lot of money on material things or things that were not helping the war effort as the enemy. And so you can see, it's kind of faint, but on the neck of this squander bug is three swastikas. And so they're trying to equate these people, these big spenders, to the Nazis, which is obviously a big comparison. And even if the British population didn't see these people as evil as the Nazis, they saw them as being an enemy to the war effort and therefore being a traitor or being seditious towards the British government. And he coined this term the squander bug because they were squandering their money and possibly squandering the British's chances against the Nazis. And I think what makes this piece of propaganda different from most others is that it's targeted, I wouldn't say it's anti-British, but it's targeted against a specific group of British citizens, whereas most British propaganda we see would either be anti-Nazi or a hopeful message towards the British. And well, we think of most propaganda as being hopeful. A lot of successful propaganda uses fear in a way to drum up support, to scare the population into doing what the propaganda wants. And I think this is the case of the British government knew that they needed to aspire the people with hope. They needed to make the people believe that they could beat the Nazis, but they needed to make them fear them enough to where they felt the need to intervene and participate in the conflict. Now, the British made thousands of pieces of propaganda throughout the World War II time, and I've only been able to show you two pieces so far, but I think these pieces do a pretty good job of summing up and showing how good of a job the British government did with being able to drum up support for the war. And I think with propaganda and charismatic speeches and messages from Winston Churchill and other politicians, they were able to turn the attitude of the British people from kind of anti-war, anti-interventionist to not pro-war, but pro-defense of their country and really a fervent patriotism in defending Britain. And the last political cartoon I wanted to show you requires a little bit more context than the other two, but I think it's very important to discuss this one as well. And this one you can see a mother and her children sitting underneath a tree, and the mother has kind of like a puzzled look, and then a ghostly Hitler figure is leaning over her shoulder and saying, "Take them back, take them back, take them back." And what this is referring to is in 1939, the British government predicted that the Nazis were going to start bombing a lot of urban areas, so a lot of heavily populated areas, and trying to kill or injure as many people as possible, and eventually get the British to surrender. Because, I mean, there's only so much death and destruction that a country can take. And so the Nazis' goal was to bomb them into submission. And so the British government put out a campaign to get families, especially, to move their children to more rural areas. However, for about a year after this campaign started, the Nazis did not end up bombing Britain's urban areas, and this was because they were still focused on conquering most of mainland Europe. They were in Denmark, they were in Norway at the time, they had just taken over France, so they weren't quite ready to begin attacking Britain. And so a lot of people, became frustrated with moving out from their homes and they wanted to go back, understandably. But the British government was still convinced, and rightly so, that the Nazis would eventually attack. And so they put out these propaganda pieces to try to convince families to stay safe in the rural areas, even if it meant, being away from home and being out of the normal routine that they were used to. But they knew it was in the best interest for families to stay away from London, from Liverpool, from Manchester, and other highly populated areas. And they're attempting to, show they depict Hitler in the cartoon, who's obviously at this point a very polarizing character. And so they're saying you're helping the Nazis out by going back, you're putting yourself in harm's way. And this was their way of saying, stay out of danger, don't risk it. And as I mentioned before, these are only three examples of the thousands of propaganda that the British government put out during World War II. But I think these three do a good job of showing a general idea of what the propaganda was and how it was effective and how it persuaded people to really buy into the war and defend Britain. And defend Britain they did. The Brits won the Battle of Britain, which was a huge aerial battle between the Nazi Air Force and the Royal Air Force, the British Air Force. And this was a long aerial battle that lasted over 3 months and saw eventually the British prevail. And this was the first major defeat of the Nazis in World War II. And so this gave hope to the other allies that the Nazis could be defeated because up until this point they had seemed unstoppable. And while, of course, there are a ton of factors that go into winning a battle, one of the key ones was the support and the fight from the British people, and the propaganda from the British government had certainly a role to play in that. And of course, eventually, after Pearl Harbor, the Americans joined the war, and the Allied forces were able to take control of North Africa and invade mainland Europe through Italy. And of course, on D-Day in June 6, 1944, Allied forces were able to storm the beaches of France and invade that way. And eventually, of course, the Russians joined the war as well and were able to stop Nazi occupation, a Nazi invasion of Russia, and counter back and march all the way to Berlin. And of course, there's tons of other battles and details that are important to the fall of the Nazis and the end of World War II, but I just simply don't have the time to cover all of them. But I think no matter what way you slice it, it is clear that the British being able to stop the invasion turned the tide of World War II, and the propaganda put out by the British government played a big role in convincing citizens to stand up for their country and fight. And so, with all that being said, I want the main takeaway to be from this video that British propaganda was effective in rallying their citizens for a cause, rallying them to fight against the Nazis, and that it really played a big role in turning the tide of World War II and eventually leading to the fall of the Nazis. And I wanted to say thank you for listening to my project. I know it was quite long, but I hope it was somewhat informative and interesting. Thank you.